Hi there, I'm Professor Joe Romani. I'm a professor of consulting and a consultant for the consulting industry. I'm going to spend a little bit of time over the next few videos to talk about some of the figures in my book. I realize that not everyone has time to read uh, my book, which was about how to grow consulting firms based on interviews with founders who have grown and sold their firms. And so I thought I'd just take you through some of the figures instead, which hopefully will be more accessible and a bit more interesting. So this is figure number one. And those of you that have done MBAs or any form of business education will probably have seen this a dozen times. It's this S-curve theory, and that is the idea that in firms you get an entrepreneurial phase of very fast growth, and then you start to hit some problems, obstacles, boundaries, and that growth starts to flatten out. And then typically what happens when you start to flatten out, you either decline because you don't solve those problems, so you decline and perhaps die, the firm retrenches, or you solve those problems and you go on to the next S curve. And then growth is a series of S curves that goes onwards and upwards. Now, let's talk through the theory before we start to rip it to bits, and talk about some of my own evidence from interviewing now 108 founders who have grown and sold their firms, but also my own experience in coaching and advising some of these founders. So you've got your start period, and the start period, it might be a few partners that get together. In effect, they're acting as independents here, but there might be some cross-selling, there might be some tax advantages, there might be some economies of scale and scope that allow you to get together. It makes sense to get together, form a company, form a limited partnership, and start selling your services under a common brand. Very often you're competitive at this stage because you're burning the midnight oil. You're working harder because you're more invested in the firm than perhaps your average employee would be working in a larger firm. Also, you might have left consulting or industry with contacts that you can sell to. So you're typically hopefully, you're getting a good growth start. There are economies of scale and economies of scope to be achieved. If a few of you are clubbing together, you can share internet costs, you can share website costs, you can share marketing costs, you can share admin costs, and all the rest of it. And so there's certain advantages. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to start as a partnership. A few successful consultancies defining success as sold within 10 years. And there are certain metrics associated with that. It's a crude measure of success. So there were certain successful consultancies that were started by one partner and stayed that way. But they're very, very rare. And kudos to people that manage to grow and sell those companies, but it does take a huge amount of work. It takes a huge amount of work anyway, no matter what way you do it. But typically, the average successful firm will be starting with 2 or 3 partners, and then they start to employ a couple of people. And really, until you get to that point where you're employing people, it's just survival. So you're taking anything that goes through the door. You're working long hours. You're not entirely sure of your niche unless you're very lucky and you start with the niche that you're going to end with. And once you start to get a bit more stable, once you start to know what's working, then you might start to employ people. And very often your first hire might be an administrative or marketing person. But your second or third hire might be consultants. They might typically more senior consultants, but you are employing them, and typically you're drawing on people that you already know, and they're kind of waiting in the background to see if you're going to be successful or not. You start to recruit these people. Now, I put 5 employees there. It could be 3, it could be 7, whatever. But the idea is that you start to become a proper company. You start to make your money off the back of employees, rather than simply by burning your own midnight oil. So it's the first stage where you really start to step back and start to say, well, we're the owners of the firm and we need to act strategically and lead and delegate, rather than it just being all about us. Now, some people can't overcome that stage. Some people either love delivery, or they can't let go, or they don't want to delegate, or they're obsessed with micromanaging, and they want to maintain the same level of quality that they would do rather than letting other people have the freedom to make mistakes. So some people simply can't get over that period, even in a high growth market and a nice pipeline of clients. Um, so that's the start phase. Before moving on, I want to explain some of the figures. So the figures on the left-hand side are crude approximations. I'll talk through them later. The figures on the right-hand side, again, crude approximations. Your average revenue per consultant might be 100,000. It might be 200,000. It might be 300,000 if you're this is per year, particularly lucky. What I have assumed here is that average revenue per consultant dips or lowers as you get larger, and that's because you take on more juniors. Certainly when you're starting up, there's probably going to be 2 or 3 seniors, up until perhaps 5-10 people. You might just be employing seniors, in which case you can charge high day rates. Once you get up to 120 plus, you're probably going to be having graduates in, because it makes economic sense to train them up rather than recruiting seniors, and there's more graduate work to do. And you're going to be charging a lot less than them. Now, that's not always the case. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, it's true. So we've got your startup phase. Then we move on to the growth phase, and the growth phase is really where you're experimenting a lot and trying to find the thing that you are. So it's very rare that you get a company leaving the growth phase doing the same thing that they started off with, because when you're starting up, you're kind of doing anything that you can do to keep the money coming in. When you start to grow, you're more stable. You're starting at least to look for stability, and you're trying to find the market and the unique value proposition and the services that work. And typically, what you'll be doing is getting those very clear, and there'll perhaps be 2 or 3 services that you're doing in 1 or 2 markets. And you're doing those very well. You're starting to establish the methods, templates, and tools that are going to be necessary for you to scale. So at this level, between say 5 and 35 people, you've got a balancing act to do. You've still got to be nimble. You've still got to experiment. You still are perhaps not entirely sure what your unique value proposition is and what your services that you're going to be scaling eventually are going to be. So you're still experimenting, but at the same time, you can't have 35 people coming to the founder and saying, what should I do now? If this works sufficient, etc. So you need to start to put in place the systems, processes, roles that are going to allow the leadership team to step back a little bit and focus on leadership, finding business, and all the rest of it. And allow the juniors to get on with the work. And this is really where you start to think about utilization rates, and you start to think about revenue per consultant. You start to think about the project margins that you're focusing on. Now, a key thing here is managing quality. And this, when you're a larger firm, it's always easier to manage quality because you've got the systems, processes, templates, etc., management in place to do that. But I would say the growth period is one of the most difficult periods, because as a leader, you've kind of got to balance these 2 things: the formalization of becoming a proper company with systems, roles, processes, templates, procedures, together with being a nimble, agile, innovative company. Then once you've got to that stage, once you know what works in the market, once you're clear what your unique value proposition is, and also what your unique employee proposition is, because that becomes increasingly important as you get towards the end of the growth phase. And the reason for that is when you're growing, you're very often recruiting people that you know, and it's quite easy to do that because a lot of these people who might have been working in your old consultancy will be looking over your shoulder to see whether your firm is successful or not. And once it looks to be successful, you're probably going to get a few CVs in from people who you know, people that you've worked in. Not too difficult to recruit people. But bear in mind that employee turnover is typically 20%. So if you've got 120 people and you've got 24 people who are leaving each year and you've got to replace those, you typically can't do that through the connections in the firm itself. And if you do, you're probably not getting the best people. So you need to start to develop an employee value proposition. because consultancies work in two markets. One of them is the market for clients, and one of them is the market for employees. And especially these days, that's sometimes more of a challenge than the market for clients. And it's certainly the first time in my 20 odd years of being a consultant and consulting that this employee thing has become so important. So that becomes important. And really, what you're starting to do when you get into the scale phase is the thing that works, you're making that bigger. So this is the theory, at least, behind it, that you found the thing that works and you invest in it and you just do more of it. Now, this mentality comes from the IT industry, where you found the software that works, and in effect, you've worked out the margins, you've worked out the costs per sale, and so you're just putting more money in so that your profits get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's slightly different in consulting. I've never actually found a consulting firm that just scales one thing. Consulting is constantly a process of coming up with new products, assessing the market, understanding client challenges, and these are always changing, and evolving the firm to be slightly different than it was before. So I don't necessarily like the phrase scaling when it's applied to consulting firms, but the basic idea that you found something that works and you might want to replicate it in different markets, or you might want to establish different aligned services to your fundamental service, is the phase where you're growing. Now, at this phase, the founder needs to, or certainly the leadership team, need to take themselves out of, mostly take themselves out of delivery. So you're starting to get the leverage model. So rather than focus, as well as focusing on utilization, you're also now focusing on leverage. Because when you've only got 20 people in the firm, you haven't really got a leverage model. People are going to be moving around doing whatever. Once you get to bigger than that, once you get to 120 people, then perhaps you're going to have different service lines, or you're going to have different markets, and you're going to have another level of management that are going to be responsible for that. So you could see this as you could see the growth phases as sort of almost an organism changing and evolving. You could see it as developing new levels of management, and you could see it as maturity of your organization in terms of roles, processes, procedures, etc. And all of those things are true. So this is the theory of sort of S curves. And typically what I find is that founders who don't anticipate the problems that they're going to be encountering when they get to the top of an S curve are going to do worse than those who do anticipate them. The big difference now, I believe, is that founders are much better educated, they've got better advisors, there's more management knowledge and research that's been done about these challenges. And so people often are better at anticipating them. And a good example of this is the PSA, Professional Service Automation, technology that's available. And this solves technology doesn't solve a problem by itself. It's got to be implemented properly and all the rest of it. But PSAs, properly used, can anticipate and deal with several of the problems of complexity that typical B2B or professional services firms face when they're growing. I've done other videos on that, so I won't go into that there. But awareness of these types of solutions is a good reason why you should be looking for advisors. You should be, certainly once you get past the start phase, you should be looking for advisors. You should be reading. You should be finding people who have been there and done this, because I definitely find that leaders that don't listen or don't think they need to listen are often those that do worse. And this is no reflection on them or their intellect. In fact, actually, it's sometimes converse in that I've seen founders who have come from McKinsey, Bain, and Boston. They leave, they start up their own firm, but there's a certain perhaps level of arrogance there, and they've been brilliant consultants and they've had a fantastic career and they're great at delivery and their clients love them. So they don't need to ask for help, they think. But they've never run a firm before. They've never had to attract employees before. They've never had to think about marketing before. So all of these strategic, very important strategic things that are life or death to a small consultancy, they think they can do. And that might be true. If you're bright and able, you can learn about SEO, or you can learn about pay-per-click, or you can learn about, productization or whatever. But increasingly, as you get to the grow phase, you're not going to have time for that. And so knowing what to do, knowing what to outsource, knowing how to think strategically about these things is crucially important. Anyway, so that's figure one. I hope that was useful or interesting. If so, do put a comment in, because otherwise I'm wasting my time doing them. Okay, take care and thank you. Bye bye.